All right. I'll call to order the San Luis Obispo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, the Water Resources Advisory Committee, WRAC, and the date today is Wednesday, June 6th. So I'd like to start with a determination of quorum. So if you are a voting member, if you could please raise your hand for our count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We have quorum. Thank you so much. 14. Thank you, Linda. I'm learning. All right. And with that, let's go ahead and do introductions. I'm Andy Pease, San Luis Obispo City Council. Let's start back over here.
Sue Luft, Environmental at Large.
Tim Walters, Development at Large.
Don Chartrand, Central Coast Salmon Enhancement.
Alex Fitchka, Central Coast Salmon Enhancement and Stillwater Sciences.
Dennis Laux, District 1.
Greg Graywalt, District 5.
George Kendall, County Farm Bureau.
James Green, County Farm Bureau.
Jason Yeager, Ag at Large.
Ethan Bell, Stillwater Sciences.
Steph Wald, Central Coast Salmon Enhancement.
Aaron Floyd, City of San Luis Obispo.
Scott Duffield, Heritage Ranch Community Services District.
Cool, that's the one. San Luis Obispo County, Public Works.
Cheryl Conway, Coyotes Advisory Council.
Ed Eby, Napomo CSD.
Greg Armstrong, Napomo CSD. Bill Garfinkel, 2nd District.
Christine Mulholland, Environmental at Large, Alternate. Linda Chipping, Coastal San Luis, RCD.
John Reed, Camp San Luis Obispo.
Eric Greening, Environmental at Large.
David Chipping, the same.
Brendan Clark, SLO County Public Works.
And Terry Crable, SLO County Public Works.
And Ray Dienzo, SLO County Public Works.
We're doing introductions.
Sorry.
That's Linda.
Is it my turn?
Yeah, it's your turn.
Is that what you're all looking at?
Yeah.
I'm Linda Seifert, and I represent District 3.
Great, thank you so much. And then before we get into the regular agenda, I'd like to take a minute to invite Colt up here as the new Public Works Director to say hi and a little bit about yourself.
Sure. If you want to come up there.
Yeah, if you want to just...
Sure. Okay. I didn't know I was coming up.
You could do it from there if you want.
That's okay. Hi, Colt
Better
Deswan,
visibility.
Public Works. I've been here about a month and a week or so, checking things out, working with staff. The water group's really good. Met with all the cities, city managers and public works directors now at this point, and even the utilities director for SLO. So I'm making my rounds, touring the facilities throughout the region. We've got a great approach, I think, so far for thinking about how we're going to solve our water supply issues in the county. So I look forward to seeing that event.
Great. And where did you come from?
Before this, Santa Cruz County, and prior to that, Stanislaus County, City of Stockton, and United States Navy.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your last name.
Essenwine.
Essenwine.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Now it's time for review and approval of the meeting minutes from May. Are there any changes, comments, corrections? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion. Oh, yeah.
Motion to approve.
Thank you. Bill, second?
Second.
Linda? All right. And we'll go ahead and do a roll call.
Dennis Laux,
Yes.
Bill Garfinkel,
Yes.
Linda Seifert,
Yes.
Jim Gehring, let's see, okay. Greg Graywalt,
Yes.
Kurt Bollinger or Patrick Williams, Jason Yeager,
Yes.
Greg Nestor or Tim Walters,
Yes.
Sue Luft,
Yes.
Eric Greening,
Yes.
David Chipping,
Yes.
Linda Chipping,
Yes.
Michael Broadhurst or Tom Mora. Okay. John Reed,
Yes.
George Kendall,
Abstain.
Anthony Lindstrom. Stephen Sinton. Okay, let's see. Okay. Debbie Peterson. Marcia Guthrie. Andy Peace.
Yes.
Scott Duffield.
Yes.
Craig Armstrong.
Yes.
James Colwell. No. Okay. Tina Meyer. All right, motion carries.
Great, thanks everyone. All right, going to go into the ongoing updates, starting with the rain and reservoir report. Anyone have anything they want to comment on? So I'd like to take a minute, just on the rain, just to note that we're kind of ending our rain year officially next month, officially this month. And so the numbers that we have look like they're going to hold, and they're ranging from kind of on the low side, low 50s, 50%, up to 70, 72%. This kind of looks like what we're getting for the year. So just kind of making sure we're observant of that trend and see how we do the next year. And then on the reservoir updates, the city of San Luis Obispo recently amended our safe annual yield based on new climate data. And so I was hoping Aaron Floyd could take a sec to just say what our process was and why we ended up with that change.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So on May 15th, we did bring an update to the City of San Luis Obispo's general plan, specifically the water and wastewater element. And in that, we updated the safe annual yield. So that is actually the amount of water that we can safely withdraw on an annual basis from the coordinated use of both Salinas Reservoir and Whale Rock Reservoir. And this action was taken after coming out of the longest duration drought that we had on record since the reservoirs were in place. We realized that that impact of those 6 super dry years really had to lower the amount that we could rely on every year. So as part of our just very conservative approach to water management, we wanted to conduct this study and see what real impacts this had. So what we discovered through the course of this study is where beforehand we were able to withdraw 6,900 acre feet per year. The study, in light of the drought, in light of some other conservative approaches and approaches we took towards climate change, we recommended to council, and council adopted a reduction down to 4,900 acre feet per year. So we really did lower about 2,000 acre feet per year off of that safe annual yield that we can take from those 2 reservoirs. To put that into perspective, the city currently uses about 5,500 acre feet per year to meet all of its demands. So pretty significant reduction right there. But that is the impact of the drought, and that was the, we have policies in place in our general plan that actually did direct us to take that action.
Does the city produce from wells also?
The city does have groundwater available to it. We use it for non-potable purposes at this point. Groundwater definitely brought the city through the last major drought, the 86 through 91, but at this point we are relying solely for our potable needs off the surface water combination of Nacimiento, Salinas, and Whale Rock Reservoir.
Now, how much is your allocation to Nacimiento, and how much do you use a year?
5,482 acre feet per year on a contractual basis. Last year we used about 3,380. So depending upon the drought strategy, we balance that out with our other water sources. There is embedded energy cost in the light from bringing that water down as far, but it is definitely one of the major parts of our water portfolio.
Now, do you just put that in a reservoir, or do you clean it and use it as soon as it comes out the pipe?
We clean it and use it right away. We bring it down and actually treat it just like any of the other sources at the water treatment plant up on Stunner Road.
So is it still cost effective then not to use the rest of your water because it's a use it or lose it every year, same amount?
Yeah.
And store and keep the other water stored for emergency that isn't that way?
Are you asking?
Okay, so you get a set amount of water every year from Nacimiento.
Correct.
And you can't roll it over.
Correct.
So you have water stored that you could save and roll over and add to, and that you can't.
So why aren't we using 100%
Why aren't you using 100%
Nacimiento?
of that first before you use your other sources?
So why aren't we using 100% of Nacimiento every year? The expense on pumping it down from Nacimiento is so much more, not to mention the environmental impacts of all the embedded energy to pump it the extra, it's about 50 miles to there. So we do a variety of water management, so part of it to roll those out. As we discovered in that study, it evaporates whether we use it or not too. It's not like an underground reservoir that we just have sitting there that it's not immune to the other climate factors on it. So when we start looking at that, if we don't use it, it's not like it just sits in a bank account and doesn't go anywhere. It will evap out either way. And actually, during many times of the year, we're actually losing more to evaporation than we are actually to usage. So that's the strategy on that. Salinas also such a large watershed into a relatively small lake, fills and spills pretty quickly. What we've been at.
Right. Well, and then you also have a live stream agreement there and other situations that factor into that. But
Correct.
I was just looking at the fact that the same thing with all the other people that get water out of Nasi, since there's only, I know it's 17.5, but 1,000 stays there for heritage.
Yeah.
So out of the rest that's there, it's not going to grow. It's the same amount every year regardless of whatever. And you guys are guaranteed your water no matter what from that. So, okay. Thank you.
Did you call this a dependable yield or a safe yield?
Safe annual yield.
Safe. Well, I'm used to safe yield with respect to groundwater, and we talk about safe yield is the amount of water you can take out of the ground without causing harm, some kind of harm. You're talking about yield out of surface supply.
Correct.
Why is that called safe?
It is the amount that we can withdraw on an annual basis without running out.
Oh, it's dependable, not really
You can call it
safe.
dependable in a way. It's kind of that nuanced. Yeah, you do see it more in the groundwater parlance of it.
And do you have a safe yield term for your groundwater?
Do we actually have a figure for that? That is actually part of the Sigma process that we are going through right now. Will be to help us understand that better. We have some upper thresholds that were available through historic use. We know what the upper limits are at this point, where we have seen some overdraft and the like. But off the cuff estimates, 1,500 acre feet, 1,000 acre feet.
Yeah, first, thank you for honoring the live stream agreement with the North County. A couple of decades back, the city was looking at raising Salinas Dam, and at that time the plan got a lot of opposition from the North County. Since that time, there have been a lot of voices in the North County not only talking about, but even going to Washington and Sacramento and trying to get funding for a project there, as if it would be something that would benefit the North County. What is this? We know that the old EIR is stale. We know that there are significant safety questions and significant areas along the Salinas where people live that could be inundated if a higher dam fails. What right now is the city's position on whether or not such a project would be pursued, and if so, to whose benefit, and would it result in renegotiation of the live stream agreement?
That is a complex question. I think it's a fair question. I'll try to answer that to the best that I can there. Again, that would definitely be a policy level decision that would have to have so many players involved in that conversation to even come to kind of a plan for what may or may not be with Salinas. At this point, I think after the last drought, there is, I'm going to speak as a generality, there is much more of an environment at hand that a regional approach to water resiliency is out there. At this point, there is nothing concrete that the city is saying one way or another that we are going to embark on a project to do anything up there. I think that we'll have to kind of see what comes out of it. I've heard a lot of different things too. Interest in North County. I know a lot of people are looking at that as an opportunity there to kind of partner in or see what may be possible. I really don't have anything I can say definitively. Cole, do you know anything different on this? Not putting you on the spot. I know you're newer to this too in some of these conversations.
I mean, I've read fairly extensively on the topic and the DC notes, but as he said, it's going to take a big group of people to figure it out. So there's nothing that we can say definitively at this time that would satisfy them, I think.
I hope that helps, Eric.
Sounds like it's not imminent.
No, I would definitely say nothing is right now, but I think, with any approach, I think, kind of our approach has been remaining open-minded and trying to, really just see what is and what is not a possibility. I mean, we really, I think through organizations like this, through kind of what we're trying to do with the WRAC is no longer look just in an insular fashion of, this is ours and let's hold it right here. I think what we're looking for is how do we look for those regional opportunities to really help each other out.
Well, if things start moving in any particular direction, we'll know to put something on the WRAC agenda.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment there. Thank you. Great. Anything else? Yeah. Patricia.
If you have a history over time of the amount of NASI water that you have used and project you're going to use, do you have the option to sell the difference?
There is an opportunity there. That is something the NASI partners are actually exploring right now is what would that look like? And there's a couple different ways that could happen. It could happen in permanent sales, though most of that kind of was on the table about 2 years ago before the full allocation of Nacimiento actually occurred. At this point, the partners are exploring opportunities for temporary sales, those maybe 2 to 5 year sales of Nacimiento water. It is something that I think we are trying to, as a group, understand a little more what that market would look like, how would that actually happen. So there is some conversation that would occur with that. And then each of us, as the respective partners in the Nacimiento project, would bring that back to our governing body, councils and the like, for approval to proceed with any kind of a recommended short-term sale.
Do you have any time frame about these discussions and when there might be some decision about that?
About when the market or what that might look like? I would say we would probably have a better idea of what that might look like in 6 to 12 months, 12 months or so. Looking over, I know county is doing some work on this. We're all kind of doing some really initial upfront, just trying to even scope out what that would look like at this point. But we're hoping 6 to 12 months we might have something a little more defined at least of what it could look like. To at least begin the conversation.
One last question about when the partners took the rest of the allocation, the 6,000 acre feet that the county was put up front because there wasn't anybody to take that at the beginning so the project could be completed.
Yeah.
The county taxpayers paid $1.2 million for 6 years.
From the ad valorem tax.
Yeah. Well, is that money ever going to be returned to the taxpayers now that they passed over the 6,000 acre feet to all the other members?
I don't think that that's really a question that the city is going to answer at this point.
Well, I'm always looking at it because I'm always told by different supervisors and stuff that the people that are paying for the stuff, I have the zone of benefit. And the county taxpayers throughout the whole county didn't get any benefit. Just the people that are the contractors on the particular pipeline. So I think we did a loan that we are not getting paid back for until everybody took the water. And if they're going to sell the water and make money on it, that money should be repaid to the taxpayers.
Comment noted. Thank you. All right. Anyone else? All right. So let's go on to the groundwater basin management efforts.
I don't have anything to ask.
I think just of note is the where we're Sigma, just the change in priorities in some of the couple of the basins. Tascadero dropped, Los Osos dropped, and I understand that San Luis Obispo actually moved from medium priority to high priority. So So, there. Okay, and then going on to Stormwater Resource Plan. We have some Sarah and Brendan to give us some updates there.
Hi, so I'm Sarah Crable. I work for the Water Resources Division for the County Public Works Department. And just a little info about the Stormwater Resource Plan. So California Senate Bill 985 was an update to the water code and required the development of a stormwater resource plan for public agencies wishing to receive grant funding for stormwater or dry weather runoff capture projects. So tomorrow in this room, we're going to have a stakeholder and public meeting at 9 a.m. and we're going to be providing an update on the progress of the development of the stormwater resource plan, as well as an update of the submitted project list. And then there will be a few presentations from public agencies who have submitted projects to that list. And a public draft of the stormwater resource plan will be available in mid-September. And we will have another stakeholder public meeting around that time as well. So for more information, you can look at discussion item C in your packet, and we have a flyer on the back table, as well as a mailing list that you can sign up for on the county's Stormwater Resource Plan website. Any questions?
I just have one. Is the rather zen concept of dry weather runoff capture.
Super zen, right?
Yeah, what is that?
So my understanding of that, I may have to refer to my supervisor Milan, but if there are any spills, like industrial spills, and that are not related to a storm event, and what do you do with those types of things? So, yeah. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Brendan Clark with San Luis Obispo County Public Works. My primary role is the IRWM Program Manager. I wanted to update you on the program, and there's two main things going on right now. That's the 2018 plan update and also the first round of Prop 1 grants. And so the plan is currently being updated by staff to the latest standards by DWR, and we are tentatively on the schedule with the board in fall for that to be adopted and submitted to DWR for review. The grant, the timing continues to be pushed back by DWR as they work out the details, and we expect that currently the schedule says the draft will be out in September, with the final coming out in December. So awards for that grant wouldn't be until mid-2019. So those are the main updates. Our next meeting is scheduled for August 1st in this room. And if you'd like to join the mailing list, or I have some copies of our meeting schedule, and it has some of these details on it, or any specific questions, I'll be available in the back after the meeting. So, awesome. Yes?
Looking a little farther ahead, I note that it now appears pretty certain that Proposition 68 passed, and that it may be a while because some of the criteria for the monies that will come through the different agencies haven't yet been written. But do we have any idea of a timeline on when those granting opportunities will become available?
I would say I don't think so.
I can speak to that. So I met with Mr. Laird at the state level, and they already have a budget for $1 billion that's going to come from Proposition 68, set to go into effect starting July 1. So I would expect, and may find it hit hard and heavy right away. So
cool.
I expect that we'll see some stuff really soon after July 1 from Proposition 68.
Would our earworm working group be the appropriate group to be kind of looking at that, or do we need to create some kind of a new entity? I know some of the grants have different foci like wildlife habitat and parks and so on, but a lot of it has to do with watershed protection, water quality, etc.
I think that would depend on how, I'm guessing. So that would depend on where DWR focuses their allocation from the proposition. So it's unknown at this point. Maybe we'll know more starting in July.
There's an allocation list. If you can look up what they used to be called SB5, and if there's certainly some well-documented information on the internet that you can get. If you just look up SB5, in fact, there's like $350 million of that billion that's earmarked for the San Joaquin Valley Delta system there for the levees. So they're in the Central Valley. So there's a significant chunk going straight to them, and there'll be another $200 or so million that are going to be up for a competitive process for levee type systems, of which that same system that's getting the 350 is going to be able to compete for as well. It was that Sac Valley, Central Valley system was a high priority, in fact, that bill. And then there's going to be significant other opportunities for clean water type grants coming forward. But if you look up under SB5, there was some draft tentative divisions for that money. And as I said, it's in the budget. It's in the state's budget already, that $1 billion program.
All right. Anything else? Great, thank you. Okay. And now, item D, 3D, various county water programs, policies, and ordinances. There was an update in the packet.
Yeah, no one from Patty is here, so.
Any other? Okay.
Updates have changed.
And then finally, just a chance, open reporting on water conservation opportunities and information. Anyone have anything they want to report? All right, great. Okay, so now we're going to have a presentation on groundwater-dependent ecosystems, Central Coast Salmon Enhancement, and Stillwater Sciences. Steph, I don't know if you're leading this or team. All right, pointing to Ethan. Great, come on up.
Hello, I am Ethan Bell. I'm a consultant with Stillwater Sciences. I am an aquatic ecologist. And Alex Wijka, who's a hydrologist with Stillwater Sciences and also works with Central Coast Salmon Enhancement. And I put this together. We've been working for a variety of different clients on groundwater sustainability plans as a result of SGMA in a variety of capacities. And I'm guessing that most of the folks here today, you're either directly or peripherally involved with the development of GSPs following SGMA. So I'm not going to talk broadly about SGMA today, but I'm going to focus in on one element of SGMA, which is it does call out as one of the as one of the beneficial uses groundwater dependent ecosystems. So there is an environmental water consideration under SGMA. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've been interpreting about, how other clients that we've been working with have been interpreting it, and how to identify them and how to incorporate them into your groundwater sustainability plan. And if people have questions, I've got 20 minutes and I've got about a 20-minute presentation, so if you have questions, we can hit them along the way. So I think we're all aware, if you're working with the groundwater sustainability plan, that we have beneficial uses to consider sustainability for urban and agricultural water use. But the plan also does have a consideration for the sustainability of groundwater-dependent ecosystems. And so the question then becomes, what is a groundwater-dependent ecosystem, and what does it mean to come up with sustainability criteria for them? I'm not sure if I have a pointer in here or not. We do. So basically, if you have a groundwater basin that is connected to your surface flows, then any of the aquatic systems or the riparian systems that are dependent on that surface flow is going to be a groundwater dependent ecosystem. So any of the instances where you have a groundwater basin that is hydrologically connected, and that might be all the time, 24/7. It might only be for 1 week out of the year, or it might be every 5 years. If you have an ecosystem that's just then dependent on that, then it's a groundwater dependent ecosystem. So here's a case where you have like a losing reach. So Santa Maria River, Salinas River, you have groundwater down here, and the surface flow is losing into that reach. It's disappearing, except for when it's not, right? Except for when it actually is connected and you have surface flow. So for example, that might be when your anadromous adult steelhead are migrating upstream. Even if it's for 10 days every 5 years, during that time it's connected. And then you have, of course, the more obvious case is a gaining reach, so the water's flowing through, maybe it's bedrock. In any case, you have a reach where the groundwater is actually coming to the surface in a gaining reach, and then you have any of your critters that are living in that creek or riparian next to it that are going to be dependent on a fairly obvious situation. And then in contrast to these two cases, we have a groundwater basin, or in this case, this would be a confined aquifer that is underneath that surface flow. It's disconnected from the surface flow. And you have aquatic ecosystems here, you have riparian ecosystem here, but it is disconnected from that groundwater basin, and in this case, these would not be groundwater dependent ecosystems. So you come across your stream reach and you're trying to figure out, what exactly do I have here? Is this one, do I have a deep groundwater basin that's connected, or a deep groundwater basin that's disconnected? Of course, that's going to take a fair bit of monitoring, putting in shallow wells, and actually looking at that profile and the gradient of your basin to determine what situation you're working under. Part of the question becomes, what do you do in the interim? You're developing a groundwater sustainability plan, you're putting out a bunch of wells, you're monitoring, and we are working with clients who are saying, well, in the interim, I'm going to assume that I have a connected system, and I'm going to start identifying my groundwater dependent ecosystems, assuming that they are connected, and I'm going to start coming up with sustainability criteria, assuming they're connected. And then as the data comes in, if a couple years from now, I can make a strong case that this is a disconnected aquifer, then I'll throw that out. Or, but they're being proactive. And some, I'm also working with other clients who are saying, nope, not connected. I'm going to put all my energy into proving it's not connected. And one of the questions under Sigma is whose burden of proof is it to show that your groundwater basin is either connected or disconnected from those ecosystems? And I imagine there'll be some court cases to settle some of that. But in any case, here's some examples of some groundwater dependent ecosystems. Here's the most obvious case. We have a gaining reach, it's a perennial stream, the steelhead and the whatever California red-legged frog, whatever species that are in here, the riparian, this is all a groundwater dependent ecosystem. Here's like an estuary that's downstream of, you have a groundwater basin, it's flowing, it eventually ends up in this estuary, this ecosystem within this estuary, water quality and all of that, beneficial use of that groundwater. Here you have a spring-fed pond. So pretty clearly you have a pond, right? I mean, you have a spring that's just essentially the leaking of your groundwater, and it's filling into this pond, and that's creating habitat for aquatic vegetation and California red-legged frogs and other amphibians. And here's a seep. So the seep is just barely little water flowing out. You don't even have a pool of water. It's still providing habitat for sensitive plant species and amphibians, another groundwater dependent ecosystem. So, and then in contrast, vernal pool, this is habitat that is created by precipitation-driven events. It is disconnected from any local groundwater. This is not a groundwater-dependent ecosystem. So here's a case where we have a losing reach. So this is a stream in San Obispo County, goes through a losing reach. Everything upstream of this is dry. Everything downstream of it is dry. But you have these bedrock constrictions here that's actually forcing groundwater to the surface over a space of just a couple thousand feet. Well, that ends up providing refuge habitat for steelhead during the summer. This reach was wetted even during the driest part of the drought, the latest part of the summer. So this ends up being critical refuge habitat. So spatially, it's a small area, but clearly a groundwater-dependent ecosystem that would need to be managed for. So You can also have it for vegetative communities. Here's a case where you have, this happens to be from the Santa Clara River. You have long reaches that are, in this case, perennial, long reaches that are intermittent and dry. We looked at this. It's been that way for about 150 years, the same reaches being perennial and the same reaches being intermittent. And you have established forested wetland complexes that are forming in those areas where you have these perennial reaches, even though they're short in distance. So those are another case of a groundwater-dependent ecosystem, those wetlands and forested complexes in association with those perennial reaches. So you're working on your own groundwater basin, and the question is, do I have a groundwater-dependent ecosystem here or not? The state DWR has put out tools. You can go onto these. You can go onto this mapping set, and you can look, and it says, "Oh, look, there's a perennial vegetative communities all throughout my stream reaches in my groundwater basin." And you can either say, "Okay, great, I've got a whole lot of groundwater-dependent ecosystems that I need to manage for," or you can look more closely at that and ask the question, that's the potential, but you can actually push back and say, and kind of ask the question, are these really groundwater-dependent ecosystems? And some people are saying, oh, okay, here's the map. Looks like I've got to manage for these groundwater-dependent ecosystems throughout my groundwater basin. And some people are looking at that and going, I don't know. And they're doing more intensive monitoring, site-specific monitoring, to actually determine if they're dealing with a groundwater-dependent ecosystem or not. Also, this is telling you that you have an ecosystem in the really general sense. A bunch of plants, some water, but what does that actually mean for developing criteria that I can put into my plan that I can manage for? Am I just managing for ecosystem, or exactly what are my response variables? What are my criteria that I can that are actionable that I can put into a plan and actually manage for? So you're identifying that you have this groundwater. This approach slide is laid out from the Nature Conservancy's handbook, which has been helpful for some. But if you identify your groundwater-dependent ecosystems and you want to determine what the effects on that are, and you want to come up with some actionable criteria, we're finding that it's hard to manage for ecosystem, and it's much more straightforward to pick focal species within that ecosystem, keystone species, that if you can manage for that species, you are essentially managing for the ecosystem, and that way you can actually focus on a specific species, their habitat requirements, and develop criteria accordingly. So, for example, in San Luis Obispo County, we do have the endangered Southern California steelhead, and we're finding that it's helpful to focus in some communities on steelhead. And I know Freddie's going, those aren't steelhead. Those are Chinook. But that's okay. Because we don't it's hard to find a place where you have this many steelhead in one spot. Was that what you were laughing at? No? Okay, something else. Okay. I thought I could sneak past a slide of spring Chinook. These are spring Chinook using cold water refuge habitat. So it is analogous. So when we look at a groundwater-dependent ecosystem focusing on key species, we first ask the question, are these species present? So, many people who are managing groundwater don't want to manage for steelhead if they don't occur. So, and critical habitat is put out by the National Marine Fisheries Service, tends to be pretty broad brush. So the first thing we do is we go out there and actually see if you have these species present.
Are you checking the year after the sandbar at the creek mouth actually opened up so that the steelhead could get up there?
Yeah, absolutely. But also, steelhead have more than one life history, and they also have a life history where, the resident life history, what some people refer to as trout. So, in many of these streams, even if the bar has been closed for 5 years or 10 years, there's still steelhead resident in those upper tributaries and detectable.
Yeah, if they have circumstances to survive up there that long.
Yeah, and so and maybe they're present up there, maybe they're not. Maybe there's a bunch of barriers in the lower watershed that are preventing anadromous occupancy, and if those issues aren't addressed, you may not want to do a whole lot of management for your species in the upper watershed without addressing those issues in conjunction. So we're also looking at another species that works well as a focal species for groundwater-dependent ecosystems is California red-legged frogs, which are in these seep springs. Yeah.
We're looking in pools of water, and yet you showed in the Ventura River a very significant area which had presumably underflow, but had no surface water.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at criteria on the condition of riparian-dependent vegetation as an indicator? Because, for example, in the drought here, we saw in the upper reaches of many small streams all the willows die.
Yeah.
In large amounts.
Mm-hmm.
That was the indicator of harm.
Yeah.
And around Bishop, that was an indicator of overpumping by Los Angeles when all the cottonwoods started dying, even though they were in grassy meadows with no river near them. Are the criteria being developed for riparian plant condition?
Yes, there are, and that is part of mapping out vegetative communities. So you're mapping out those vegetative types that depend on having inundated roots in order to exist. So cottonwoods, alders, birch, and we're actually mapping where those occur as a groundwater-dependent ecosystem, and then to look at criteria for whether or not they are being sustained. We're doing imagery, and you can actually look at the actual stress of those plants, and so you can actually monitor the stress of those vegetative communities over time. So in that case, from the Santa Clara River, those vegetative communities, we're mapping where they occur, and some of those there may not be visible surface flow in association with those, but the community itself is an indicator that there's a high enough groundwater that their roots are inundated and they are a groundwater-dependent ecosystem. So California red-legged frogs is another good species, is a focal species. They have requirements for groundwater and to be sustained require water at various times of year over various scales. So we use protocol level surveys to determine if they occur or not, and we try not to do a whole lot of management for them if they don't occur, so we start with that. And there's also other sensitive species, this Coast Range newt, but there's other sensitive amphibians that also work well as focal species in a groundwater-dependent ecosystem, especially if you don't have a listed species present. So this is an example of vegetative community. So this is mapping out. So there is very little surface flow here, and this surface flow is probably going to disappear at some point. But you still have this groundwater-dependent riparian zone, and we're using low elevation aerial photography. So basically, flying drones up and down these rivers and mapping those out, and then we can also use full spectrum imagery to look at. Well, I'm sure that folks here are doing the same thing for looking at grapes and the quality of and whether or not they need water or not. We use the same exact imagery to look at the riparian zone and the amount of stress that it's under, and whether or not it needs water. So you've identified that you have a groundwater-dependent ecosystem. You've identified your focal species, and then the question becomes, what are the impacts of groundwater on those species? How much water do they actually need to exist? Coming up with some criteria, some actual actionable, implementable criteria that you can use. So we have a variety of techniques for then focusing in on specific species. And of course, you have an impact where you have an estuary that's just drying up. Well, you need to have some water to maintain decent water quality to support the species that are there. So in that case, we might use a criteria like dissolved oxygen, water temperature, salinity. Those would be response variables that you could measure in a field to maintain suitable conditions. Looking at the riparian zone, you have a declining groundwater, and that's getting to the point where it's going to actually become disconnected from your riparian zone root masses, and that's monitorable. You can monitor that and over time and maintain it to a certain level. And under Sigma, there is consideration for what your baseline is, the 2015 baseline. But in any case, maintain it to a level that supports that ecosystem. For assessing impacts on steelhead, there's a number of good methods, and we've actually done a fair bit of that work in the county more regionally for the county, of looking at what our in-stream flow needs for steelhead and watersheds throughout the county. But essentially, we're looking at how much water do they need, how much water do they need during the spring for feeding, during the summer to just survive, and then during the winter for winter and spring for fish passage, adults to get up and smolts to get out. We don't focus so much on fish passage because that's typically a precipitation-driven event. That's not going to be dependent on groundwater. George?
That upper graph, is that cubic feet per second?
Yeah.
And can you tell me what the spring flow and the summer flow is?
Well, this particular hydrograph, I mean,
I presume those are your minimum limits or your preferred range or something?
Oh, yeah, I didn't actually, this is just a bar to indicate the needs for steelhead during the spring are for juveniles feeding. The amount of water that would be needed would be different in different streams. So in your creek, about 2 CFS in the spring is going to be enough flow to feed a bunch of juvenile steelhead in Santa Rosa Creek near your house. Whereas in another river, a lot more water might be required at the same time of year, or in a creek a lot less.
And in September?
And at the end of the summer in September, steelhead during that time of year are very often not feeding. They're basically barely surviving, but it takes a lot less water. They have a pool, adequate water depth, where they can actually survive during that stressful period. It takes a lot less flow in the creek to achieve that. Obviously, if you dry the creek out, they don't like that very much. So in Santa Rosa Creek, that might be like half a CFS. I can't remember exactly.
That's right. It's 0.4, 0.5.
Oh, there, yeah.
Right in your backyard, George.
One factor to be aware of, people often use erosion as a dirty word, but the active undercutting of banks can actually, where it's permitted to happen, be useful to steelhead, both by digging out gravel that forms the spawning beds and by creating overhung shaded pools that both remain because of their thermal protection from the direct sunlight, and also so that the yearlings aren't being picked off by kingfishers dropping down.
Yeah, absolutely. So steelhead have a whole variety of habitat requirements throughout the year, different parts of the creek. And for the natural ecosystem that they rely on, they're relying on a whole series of geomorphic and hydrologic processes, including large flows that come down the creek and tear in large woody debris and stack that tear up side channels and create off-channel habitat. All those things are needed. But in the context of managing your groundwater basin, those are typically processes that you can't control by how you manage your groundwater basin. Unless you're putting in a large dam that's capable of capturing big high flow events during the winter, which is not typically addressed in these GSPs. We're talking specifically about response variables to protect steelhead, criteria to protect steelhead that can be affected by how you manage that groundwater. And that typically, most notably, is during the dry season and also potentially during the spring season. So during this, if depending on how much surface flow is being left in the creek during the spring and summer, that's really the time period that is of most relevance in these GSPs. And then in terms of how much water is required, we're actually going out in the field and mapping how much habitat's available at certain flows and looking for what's the minimum amount of water that you need to provide habitat for fry, juveniles, the different life stages. Steelhead, we're looking at fish passage, how much water does it take to get through a critical ripple so that fish can move up and down that stream, particularly juveniles in the spring, can be small. We're also looking at these migratory requirements over large reaches, so like in the Santa Maria Basin, which is a massively losing reach in the lower part. You drive over the 101, it's always dry. But it is a groundwater that is connected to the surface flow, and steelhead require that connection to that groundwater about once every 5 years to get through this lower reach. And then the question is how much flow it takes to get through that reach. And depending on what the level of groundwater is in there, it changes and determines how much flow it takes to get the steelhead through there. So if the groundwater basin is actually higher and has more recharge, then you're going to have a lower flow is required to get adults through there, and you end up having more days per year on average of passable conditions. So in this process, just circling back to this process, you have identified whether or not you have a groundwater dependent ecosystem. You're looking at what the effects is in that specific watershed of your groundwater on specific local species. You've established some sustainability criteria. You've said, okay, steelhead are going to need a certain amount of flow during this time of year. We want to maintain a wetted pool for California red-legged frogs during their breeding season. So that'd be a case where you don't need to protect your California red-legged frog. You don't necessarily need to have that pond full year-round, but you definitely need to have it full during the breeding season, and you've kind of come up with some criteria for that, and that leads into some specific actionable criteria you can put into your plan, and then of course you'd want to have monitoring in association with that. And that monitoring is not necessarily the shallow wells or the different types of wells that you're going to be doing in any case through your plan. This is monitoring that's going to be specifically on your groundwater dependent ecosystem, looking at potentially riparian stress, riparian plant community stress, whether or not you're maintaining conditions that are suitable for some of your focal species and so on. And that leads to specific monitoring actions and also other types of management projects that you might put into place for the protection of those species. And then that feeds into hopefully into your GSP. And DWR likes it, and the Water Board approves it, and it all goes swimmingly. So there's a number, obviously, as you guys know, there's a number of resources out there, but there are a number of resources that are focused specifically on incorporation of the groundwater dependent ecosystems, and some actually this very county also has additional materials on protection of environmental water demand linked off the county website. So that's what I've got. Does anyone have any more questions about this?
Yeah, interesting report, thank you. I'm a little concerned about the definition or the use of the word groundwater, because in groundwater law, it's not all water in the ground is groundwater, and yet that's the way you're using it. I don't know whether that has any consequences on your work, but it seems to me that it's a little ripe for misinterpretation depending on people's background.
Yeah.
Have you run into that before?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I was trying to get at with that first slide, that not all water in the ground is groundwater. And that's kind of the first question is, I mean, because this hyporheic flow, it's water, and it's water in the ground, but it's not groundwater. And so we're working with some entities that are assuming that they have an ecosystem that's connected to the groundwater, and they're starting to come up with ways to protect it. Meanwhile, doing all the monitoring to either demonstrate definitively that it is connected to groundwater under the law, or that it's not connected to groundwater under the law.
And you run into the problem where basically you go from stream flow to underflow to groundwater, and there's no marker. And the state board used to say, well, if it's deeper than 60 feet under the bottom of the stream, we're going to call it groundwater. But that's not really very useful either. And it seems to me that as we do these GSPs, we're going to bump into these issues, and where we're going to end up drawing new lines. But the law wasn't intended to redefine groundwater, and yet it seems like as I listen to you, maybe that's what's happening.
Yeah, and when you say bumping up against these issues, I think that's what I've seen so far is that's leading to lawsuits. And so, one entity is saying, that's groundwater, it's connected, and then the other entity is saying that it's not, and then it's getting in front of judges to determine.
Just a comment, Steve. Wouldn't the groundwater be different from the surface water plus the underflow? In other words, this is where my question came up earlier about harming the riparian corridor. That would be held up by underflow in those dry parts of the stream. So it would be treated, to my mind, the same as the surface water flow. If you are depleting the underflow, then you're causing harm to the ecosystem. So it would be
totally right.
Yeah. Underflow can do. Having the underflow is connected to your riparian zone, it could be doing damage to the ecosystem, but if it's not connected to your groundwater, then under sigma, you're not required to protect it.
But it is connected.
Yeah.
It is connected, but you're not legally connected. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe this will help a little bit in just that there's the regionally managed groundwater table that most people are probably in this room concerned with, from which you extract water, and which is defined legally as groundwater. Then there are also perched aquifers that are disconnected that may be feeding the groundwater-dependent ecosystems. Then there's also underflow and surface flow. Those four systems may intercommunicate spatially and temporally, and if that connection does exist, then our understanding is it's connected under sigma. If you're in the bottom diagram, whether it's geologically or hydrologically completely disconnected, like if you're 60 feet below at all times, temporally and spatially, if you're 60 feet below the bottom of the stream bed, you're probably in the disconnected situation there. And then it's not necessarily covering under sigma. But I really want to emphasize that when we walk the streams, even in, we're familiar with the county in quite a few locations where the groundwater, the regionally managed groundwater table is way down there. But it gets that slide that Ethan showed where it gets pushed to the surface by bedrock constrictions over short reaches, and that can be the regionally managed groundwater table that's been pushed to the surface and is a locally gaining reach, and it supports critical habitat for steelhead or frogs or other species. And I would think that would, that's just, it's looking like to me, from what limited information we all have, that could be interpreted that is connected under and managed under sigma.
Yeah, well, you're bumping sigma up against sort of historic law, which never did a very good job of sort of sorting this all out.
Yeah, I think we're all in the dark a little bit now.
Tom, did you?
I wouldn't want to think that the water boiler is going to illuminate this issue for all of you right here. But I do know that some of the issues that arise are related to groundwater that comes from the alluvial layer. And it wasn't until recently that the State Water Board required all water users to file so-called statements of diversion and use. And there are more than one groundwater well owner who thinks that they have groundwater pursuant to a county permit, but don't have any idea that their groundwater is in an alluvial layer and it's hydraulically connected, and it has these more geo-hydrological technical issues. So I think there are different levels of maybe like ignorance is bliss until you get something in the mail. So somewhere in there, I think there's a lot of, thanks to the work that Ethan and Alex and others are doing to kind of put the science together so that landowners aren't left in between trying to decode what are sometimes ambiguous regulatory jurisdictions.
Oh, I just heard the term percolating groundwater distinguished from the underflow, and I think just the lack of conflating the two terms or not distinguishing groundwater enough in this situation. That's helpful.
Are you saying that the arrows on that diagram should have a horizontal as well as a vertical direction?
No, I'm just saying that's a term that was kind of being used to distinguish those two groundwater
connections.
Yeah, connection.
Yeah.
I mean, underflow can result from percolation of former surface flow. That, again, the legal definitions are so squishy on my mind.
I disagree. The legal definitions are clear. Reality is what's squishy.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see who bears the burden of proof on if your groundwater basin is connected or not, because the burden of proof is going to be pretty expensive, I would think, depending on what spatial scale you're working at. Do that, collect that data.
Are there any criteria for defining the baseline condition, which will be considered normal, so that you can determine when harm has started? Is there going to be a universal statewide criteria for that?
Yeah, They're saying that the Sigma specifies 2015 as the baseline. And I don't know, it's not clear if that's going to mean the same for the ecosystem, but I think that was the intention. But I haven't seen it well articulated exactly what that means for ecosystems.
There's this other whole moving piece, which is the revision of the state CEQA guidelines. And the word baseline, of course, has a very distinct meaning under the California Environmental Quality Act. Whether an impact is significant, the traditional baseline is present conditions before a project happens. And baselines are being moved away from that in some areas, but so far we seem to be holding firm relative to water. But I think we have to keep watching that moving target of CEQA guidelines and also watch what might be proposed as changes to the county CEQA guidelines relative to baselines for measurement of significance.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, but I'm not sure that it's going to be relevant to the groundwater sustainability plans, because unless I'm wrong, Tom can correct me, but I don't think that the GSPs trigger CEQA.
No, but the CEQA, if we're talking about retaining the biological functions of groundwater fed surface water, certainly the question of baseline has another whole definition under CEQA that's also significant for protecting those ecosystems.
Along that line of baseline, it's also, I'm a little skeptical about 2015 being the baseline, because coming through several years of massive drought, during which time huge wells and pumps were put in all over the state, in the valley and even in our county, that drew down water to at a deplorable rate in some areas, really. And then to call that baseline now is rather scary to me.
Mm-hmm. It should be scary to you. Under Sigma, it states that the intention is to look at historical data and that it should be informed by historical data, but I'm guessing that there was the concern over requiring managers of groundwater to restore a condition to previous 2015 levels, because you can see if this is connected and you're saying, oh, well, to protect the steelhead, we need to have a groundwater basin that's the same elevation that it was in 1920. That might be pretty hard to implement that plan.
Yeah, it's kind of like having a run on your grocery store, and now there's only one roll of toilet paper left on the shelf, but that's going to be our baseline.
Yeah. So I think if you're working with these criteria for these species, that's an opportunity to develop whatever in your GSA you think is a reasonable goal and reasonable criteria to try to meet.
Well, and the other thing to consider is that your 2015 baseline ecosystem conditions are affected by decades of hydrological conditions. So, yes, your ecosystem may be stressed, but it's not necessarily the hydrological condition in terms of groundwater-dependent ecosystems, but it's the condition of the ecosystem, which has been impacted over more than 1 year, whatever its condition is in 2015.
Yeah, but that's why I'm saying, it was several years of drought, so the ecosystems have been stressed
in some cases,
during that
eliminated.
During that time, and then afterwards,
Yes.
then we set that as the baseline. Seems a little disingenuous to me.
Maybe.
Tough one.
I had thought the baseline was on the groundwater contour situation, not on the surface condition of the environment.
Yeah, there's not a clear guideline for baseline for groundwater dependent ecosystems other than 2015 and looking at taking into account historical conditions.
So that's kind of what I was going to mention. What you're talking about is not directly one of the 6 undesirable results that you have to address with Sigma. So that what that relationship is to me is still not clear.
I would agree that it's not clear.
Included, but, you know,
Yeah.
It doesn't talk about you can't have any vegetation die along the wetland area, right? So if the communities and the GSAs have to develop what those criteria are, how does this play into that development?
Yeah, it's not clear. SGMA is not clear on exactly what is acceptable and not acceptable. And so we're looking to see what the water board's going to approve and not approve, and we don't know exactly yet in terms of these criteria. We do know that the other federal and state agencies responsible for protecting these resources are weighing in, and so that's some of the definition of what is acceptable and not acceptable starting to come in. So the National Marine Fisheries Service, for example, is saying that fish passage for steelhead needs to be protected. But there isn't clear guidelines in SGMA as to what is an undesirable condition. Tom?
I just wanted to emphasize that somebody's point about definitions being a little bit of a moving target. It's well placed when you look at one agency that might be trying to create like a sustainable yield and avoid negative effects of overdraft, when another agency might be trying to create unimpaired flow, and another agency might be trying to enhance stream flow, and then another agency might be trying to create a net conservation benefit. And I think it all comes back to like, well, what is the baseline from which we're enhancing or creating a net benefit? And I think to me these are to be determined. But, there's a lot of room, I think, for this community to be in that conversation.
And some groups that we've interacted with are trying to be proactive. So they're working with the NGOs in the environmental community and all that to try to build in protection for the groundwater dependent ecosystems and criteria to protect them, trying to get out in front of some of those issues with trying to have a GSP that incorporates that from the outset, and some that I'm working with are not.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
That was super helpful. Okay, moving on, a report from the ad hoc subcommittee on additional water conservation measures that can be submitted to the Board of Supervisors for their consideration and consider actions. We had one meeting. Linda, do you want to give us a brief update on that?
We have had one meeting. It's been a little difficult because everybody's got different time frames and they're in town, out of town. But we're, with summer coming on and most of us having done a fair amount of travel by now, that we should be able to get back into addressing some of the topics that were raised. I would like to invite you to make suggestions to us. I think the one page is pretty comprehensive in terms of what we had discussed. I had a conversation before the meeting started with George, and he has some suggestions under the agricultural area. Please be aware that we fully understand that the urban water conservation measures are the ones that receive the biggest support and purview when water conservation was an issue raised, but all the low-hanging fruit has been taken care of. You can't put another brick in another 1-gallon toilet now. You can't put another low-flow device on something. We've looked at all of the different things that have been done in the urban setting. We need to expand beyond that, as either in agriculture, industry, maybe with public education, to move forward with more water conservation efforts or programs that will help us sustain into the future. So having said that, we're open to ideas and suggestions from anybody here in the room. If you would like to join us, we would be very happy to have additional people come and join us to be a part of this discussion.
Great. Thank you. I see Eric and then David.
Yeah. Obviously, with the urban area, a specific area is simply information about native plants and xeriscaping opportunities, essentially what can be aesthetically rewarding in a garden that's either being redone or where new development is happening. So that's probably sort of a subset under the conservation at an individual household level. And then I have a question about under agricultural number 6, allocations of what by whom. I think this kind of goes with what we were just hearing, that it can actually be like reservation of existing sources for environmental uses, but the word allocations makes it sound like it's project specific. What is meant by allocations? Allocations of what by whom? I'm witty in concept.
It's number
6 under agriculture.
I think what was intended on that with the committee was how, with multiple ranches and multiple agricultural projects, how do you determine fair allocation of resources? It was associated with that. That's where the equitable came in, and that presumably this is the big. The big bull in the china shop. That is, that ag is the biggest user. Ag is going to have to implement the major reductions. And how you do that fairly when you've got multiple crops and multiple investments and things like that.
Historic uses.
That's the really big issue.
So you're talking about allocating reductions or sacrifices, not allocations for ecosystems.
Fair distribution of wounds and pain. There's one interesting thing I could add. Last week, the governor signed SB 606 and AB 1668, and that mandates that indoor water use between 2007 and 2025 must be 55 gallons per day per person or less. Then between 2025 and 2030, it's reduced to 52.5 gallons, and then beyond 2030 it will drop to 50 gallons. So we have, at least for the domestic use, some targets that we can look at. It's got to be under 50.
Yeah, you know what? That guy had rocks in his head. We have more money that he's talking about spending to come up with different water metering and different water police and different things to restrict people than the amount of money it would take to finish the Prop 1 reservoirs that should have been built at Temperance and the other place, and desalination and other stuff. You're looking at something over $60 billion to enact what he wants to do there versus 30-something billion to build all the new reservoirs and storage facilities that would take to not have those rules, because they're more interested in the control than they are in solving the problem. You got on this thing here in the urban, you're talking the conservation and new building standards. Right now, over the last couple weeks, Paso Robles has had meetings to talk about adding 2,200 to 2,400 residences over areas, claiming they have no water problem. And they've already, also on top of that, want to add 280 to 300 RV spots at a particular place by the airport for tourists, and they also just approved another hotel. And this is why earlier I asked, and I'm not picking on San Luis, but it's the same problem with Paso. today, they could save 2,700 acre feet a year by using their Nacimiento water and not pumping groundwater. Yet they refuse to do that. And if they use their 6,250 feet of Naci water, their full supply before they did pump any water, you would save that much groundwater. But they refuse to do that. Even though they have the infrastructure already there to do that, they do not have the infrastructure to clean the whole 6,000 plus acre feet, because they built a clean facility that can only clean just barely less than 50% of that. But that should be their mandate and what they should be working on, instead of trying to reduce people's use, because that water is a use it or lose it concept. They also are wasting 4,000 acre feet that they're dumping into the Salinas while they're trying to build their purple pipe facility to reuse their wastewater. So you look at the other side of the people that in the rural area, the farmers and stuff, who are on septic systems whose wastewater goes right back to the ground. It's not being wasted. It's not being dumped in the river. They're at minimal uses. They're using the land to the full potential. And unlike what the governor doesn't realize, there's a state constitution that says that those people have a priority right to the beneficial use of that water, while these other places have secondary and tertiary sources that they're not using. And I think that is a really big issue that they have to be, through Sigma, when you're looking at the different ways of developing the GSP where people are supposed to be cutting back, like somebody said, there's only so many more retrofits you can put on a toilet or a faucet or something. Facilities don't use water. People use water. The more people you add, the more water you're going to use. Just because you make one household save 20 gallons a day, they're not saving that 20 gallons a day. They're using it to put over here to build another facility so somebody else can use that 20 gallons a day. And until you control the amount of resources, if you look at any building, right there on the side of that door, maximum occupancy. Well, there's maximum occupancy also for the resources that are available in certain communities. And some communities that think that they're going to permit or build their way out of their money problems, like the gentleman said, it costs more to use that other water, but if you don't use it, you're losing. And they're going to have to get to the point where this Prop 1 money and now this Prop, what was it, 68? They haven't spent one dime on Prop 1 yet on what it was sold as, to add more reservoirs and above ground storage. Yet we've created a lot more government agencies and different people to manage something that we haven't fixed the problem.
Thank you. George.
Thank you. I first want to say thanks to Linda and the committee for working on this conservation thing. I have a couple of comments that I think Congress would like to make and that I would like to make on the specific points. The first one, on-site reuse and recharge, I think is a great idea. We certainly support that. There'll be some problems with the reuse. There's tailwater issues, water quality things. There'll be some problems with the recharge, although I absolutely think that's low-hanging fruit in some of the coastal basins and in some of the interior basins. There's a huge volume of water that could be recharged or retained and not lost. But it's very difficult legally to do that. Still water people just left working on a study in the area that I live that can address some of that recharge. Pumpage monitoring, reporting, setting goals and limits, policing and remote metering. Please don't police us anymore. The point two things seem to be the realm of Sigma and DWR. And I think we should let the Sigma process and the STAs work through before we try to expand Sigma to other areas and other basins. Remote metering scares the hell out of me. Pond evaporation and loss reduction, good ideas. Irrigation efficiency improvement, yes. Also distribution uniformity. There's a lot of education to be done there as well as efficiency improvements. I was at a meeting yesterday where we talked about leaching requirements in avocados. And we were discussing drip emitters versus micro sprinklers and how important it is to actually do your leaching during rain events. That's not a real popular thing in the public, but it's what you have to do in avocado if you want to leach. Adopt basin water-wide plans as guides. Not a bad idea. I like the idea of studies. Again, Stillwater is will be doing a study on Santa Rosa Creek addressing stream flow enhancement and local groundwater recharge. And there have been some other good studies, but there's an awful lot of money spent on not so good studies. So be careful. Point 6, equitable conservation allocations under SGMA. Let's let SGMA work. Let's not tell them what to do before SGMA gets done. I think this point has to do with what Ethan was talking about. I really appreciate the work you did, and I'd be happy to come to one of your meetings.
Glad to have it.
I think there's lots of room for discussion, and a lot of good ideas here.
Thank you. If people have questions for us, you should send them to Ray, and then we can. If you're interested in joining us, contact Ray, and then when we get ready to set up our next meeting, we'll be able to let you know.
Great, thanks.
One thing I noticed our committee missed, and it's pertinent to tomorrow morning's meeting, is at what point can stormwater management be integrated into recharge? And that is one of the standard ways in urban environments for stormwater peak modification is to have in-house, in-yard capture basins. And I know the RCDs have done some work on recharge potential, I believe, in certain parts of the county. And it would seem that if you have a lot of pavement, but you have a subsoil which is rechargeable, then one would think about building standards which would allow for stormwater capture on site and percolation as a way of lowering flood peaks. I don't know if that's going to be discussed tomorrow, but it might be worth thinking about both from...
Well, those are already in place. Those rules are already in place.
They are?
Yeah.
So there's a requirement that people capture water on site?
Yep.
Yeah.
Regional Water Quality Control Board requires that.
Low impact development, swales and milestones.
Okay, so...
Yeah.
For urban sorts of developments in residential, but not ag, which I think the real potential is in ag. One comment, in the part of the world that I know something about, Santa Rosa Creek and the North Coast, virtually every tributary down in the alluviated parts of the valleys where the aquifer is, almost every single tributary has been altered, and they've basically been moved over to the sides of the valleys or straightened out. The amount of natural recharge that would have happened 200 years ago is much reduced. There's huge potential in our coastal valleys to recharge. Right? Although I'd like to hear this, we don't have a water shortage, we have a water recharge shortage.
But from the building industry point of view, is everything being done that can be done?
Well, I mean, it's a state mandate, so it's not retention, use on storage on site, all that stuff is already in place. Any improved surface is required to treat and infiltrate as the first order of business.
That's for new construction, anything that,
any new construction.
right, so it's not mandated as a retrofit, so there's a lot of existing stormwater that isn't being managed in that way.
Also,
So that's
what
an
Jordan's talking
opportunity.
about in the ag deal, if you make any diversion at all, that's all reportable, has to be documented, has to be reported, has to be measured. They got so many rules out with the Cattlemen's Association and different things on what they consider a diversion, it's unbelievable.
To the extent that this group could make a recommendation to the county to relax some of those rules to build sediment basins and do that for flood fields, that would be, it would have thousands of acre feet if we could do some of those projects.
They have classes right now that people are signing up for to be able to self-monitor and self-measure for their diversions, that they have to pay for to take the classes. That they have different, if it's 1 to 10 acre feet, if it's over 10 acre feet, if it's over 100 acre feet, for any kind of, anything that changes water or that stores water is a diversion. You put a pipe in the road so you can drive over it, even though the water is going the same direction. If you didn't get the right permit for it, it's a diversion.
Well,
Sorry, hold up just a second.
So
Go ahead.
apropos of what David was talking about it, the Shannon San Juan Water District, probably our highest priority is flood flow management to retain and use it for recharge for agricultural purposes. So it is on the radar of the agricultural users.
And that's the thing about, the GSP and this creation of stream flow enhancement and ecosystem enhancement and things like that. I am all for that. It's a very lofty goal, and unfortunately, it really gets down to kind of money driving all of those things and implementing all of those things. I think it's great, but I can just see how a GSP trying to I guess get their head around how they are going to actually fund something that does creek flow enhancement and ecosystem enhancement. It's going to be very, very difficult.
Prop 68 may open new funding sources for that, and also possibly for retrofit opportunities in urban areas. If you kind of read the language of some of the different funds and who would be administering, but it's not real clear till all the criteria are out.
Okay. Well, Linda, I think that gave us some lovely ideas to think about. Mladen.
Sorry, just to add on with Eric. So any bond grant funding for projects that capture stormwater need to be in the prioritized in the stormwater resource plan, which tomorrow we're having the informational meeting if you'd like to come to that.
Right, tomorrow's going to great. Thank you. Okay. And then just to wrap up here to discuss future agenda items. And one of the items that we had talked about last time, just a refresher from the bylaws, is that we're hoping for, it's in the bylaws to have status updates from our member stakeholders. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about what the process is for what we're thinking?
Yeah, no, we were just very simply, we were thinking about agendizing an update from different stakeholders. I know that people give reports on certain things. Like RCDs have given reports in the past, and staff has given reports in the past. But what we're talking about is like from each of the different where your member representative, like what is it? Can we update the whole group regarding water resources issues? Like a clear example, like I know Jason over there was hoping to, in the near future here, do a presentation on water conservation in the wineries, and so something like that, and to agendize it, I think would be a good thing. It's something for us to look forward to, and plus, it'll cause us to be, to interact.
Right, to connect with each other better, understand different issues. So, development at large could be, a time, 10 or 15 minutes, and then we would just kind of have a set at each meeting, 1 or 2, so that over the course of the year, we end up getting updates, and people can waive their option for that. But
like even an example that Tim said, like about the use of how like LID type stuff is being used in recent developments.
Yeah, what are the challenges, opportunities that we see? Does that make sense? Yeah.
There was a specific request last time when we had a straw poll that we agreed that a discussion of groundwater, actually instead of groundwater pumpers, it's agricultural pumpers representation, especially the Casa Basin. I don't see that on the agenda.
Okay, no, I'll add that. Yeah.
Yeah, we did talk about bringing somebody in the fall because they couldn't do it this time.
Fairly soon to be effective.
Right. Kind
Are we assuming we don't need any special meetings in the summer and that we are talking about September and beyond?
Yeah, that's what we were thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, unless something comes up, we don't see anything urgent between now and then. And then are we going to solicit volunteers for that, or we'll just kind of start assigning and then let us know if it's a problem?
Well, we're not. I didn't expect us to come up with ideas right now, but what I could do is I could solicit ideas through email to certain people, and if people have ideas that they want to send to me, that would be great too. So,
on your well permitting and regulation as a tool for groundwater management, the other day I called the health department and got all the wells that have been put in from 2014 to the present, because I was interested in finding out how many were replacement dry wells. And first they sent me that list. Over a 5-year period, there was about 120 wells that were replacement wells, and they're all in specific areas. Like there was 2 in Creston, 1 in San Miguel, none in Shandon. It was just over the North County Basin. Then I got the report on new wells that were added. There was only 8 wells in 2013, which was 0.1% of the 8,000 wells that are in North County that were dry wells that created the emergency ordinance. And I'm mapping all that stuff right now to show there's only been about 250 wells added in the last 5 years. That includes ag wells, domestic wells, and everything in over the basin. So there hasn't been a lot of what I would consider out of adding 250 wells to 8,000 isn't really, and 125 of those for replacement wells. So you're not really adding wells. That a lot of stuff has grown, or that the use has grown. So crops have changed, but. The information's out there, but it's like just putting it together and getting it ready so that you can see the actual what's going on. A lot of the areas where the replacement wells went, they were really shallow wells in the first place, and it wasn't that they didn't have water; they just had to go a little deeper. And where the best part of the water was in the aquifer anyway, because when those homes were developed, they just went to where they hit first water and called it good and didn't do anything else. And they didn't have anything else around them at the time.
So, Greg, are you suggesting that as a future agenda topic, or is that kind of specific to the SIG with the DSP?
I would do it for a future, just to show what's going on at least in the North County basin.
That's very interesting. I can make some slides and stuff.
Yeah, that does sound interesting.
I'll draw you a sketch.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, but the updates can be something as simple as that. Like it doesn't have to be a 15-minute presentation. Like just a 5-minute thing, like a one slide, or even it doesn't need to hang and have a slide.
Yeah, I think that would be super. Yeah, everybody's going to have something that they want to talk about.
Well, I think there's some other, like I'm just redoing how they changed the CAD-GEM numbers and how they changed the numbering system and how they're created different things on just for an example, CAS-GEM, the California State Groundwater Elevation Monitoring System, tells you whether you're a low, high, medium, whatever priority basin, and it's determined on your population and your dependency on groundwater, or your main functions. Well, when Atascadero was separated as a separate basin, they were supposed to, and they needed to, subtract their population and their groundwater use from the rest of the basin. Well, they only subtracted a portion of it. They used them as 11,000 for population. Well, there's 10,000 population just in Templeton, besides the 30-something thousand in Atascadero. They never added the turnout that was built in Shandon. They didn't take into consideration the 6,000 plus acre feet of Nasi water for Paso and all the other criteria of the other sources that didn't used to exist that do exist now. So I'm putting together all that information also. And I'm doing a lot of that because of the GSP thing that's going on up in North County. But I'd be happy to share that stuff too.
Okay, thank you. All right, public comment for, Christine.
Yes, I want to commend a previous member of our committee for many, many years, Joy Fitzhugh, served as the Farm Bureau representative. And I'm sure some of you are aware, but in recent times, Joy approached the San Luis Obispo County Land Conservancy, and after a 5-year process, 1,779 acres were put under a conservation easement for perpetuity. The Hill Ranch that one sees from 46 West all the way to the ocean will now be forever protected for ranching and wildlife, and specifically to our points here with water. The ranch contains the headwaters of Via Creek, which meets the Estero Bluff State Park. And by keeping the ranch in one piece, free of homes and pavement, water will make its way slowly downstream. Steelhead can thrive as they journey up the healthy creek from the ocean below. So
Thank you for bringing
Thank
that. That is awesome. All right. Any other public comments? Patricia.
I just have two things. Regarding the subcommittee about water conservation, many of these agricultural issues, as has been pointed out, will have to be addressed in the GSP for the Paso Basin. So in terms of how many monitoring places do we need, and all, really pretty much all of these points are going to be well covered in that plan according to the consultant who has been hired. And for those of us who have been at the cooperative committee meetings for the Paso Basin, we're well aware that many of these conservation items do need to be addressed and very specifically addressed. So I'm not sure how much time your committee, in terms of the Paso Basin and its plan, would want to spend on that. Secondly, I think it would be enlightening, since we've heard just kind of a critique, if you will, of the city of Paso Robles and how it's planning for build-out. It might be interesting to have someone from the city come and explain how they are planning to provide water for these developments. The Public Works Director is very capable of explaining that. And we've had some update from the city of San Luis today, so it might be enlightening for the whole committee to hear about how the city of Paso intends to provide water for this build-out.
Good thinking. Okay.
Yeah, the Shannon Advisory Committee has an item on their agenda that there's going to be 3 applicants showing up for marijuana patches around the basin, and I have no idea whether the offset ordinance has been kind of ignored because there's so much money to be made by the government and the individuals, but it's kind of a curiosity that the water part seems to have not been particularly emphasized in these new grows. You know, there's an offset requirement in the basin. I don't know whether anybody's enforcing it or not.
I had a farm bureau member call about that just the other day. And I called the county planning and talked to I think and since cannabis was placed in its own category under cannabis activities instead of ag crops and grazing, they don't fall under the Paso offset. So most of them are doing a monetary mitigation.
We know what that means. 10% for the county.
Cash. Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things I just found out about.
Thank you. That's interesting and shocking at the same time.
Mladen, did you want to add on that?
Yeah, to add on what planning is, that those fees all are going to the water conservation program.
Right.
And so there's funds available that aren't being utilized.
You're right. I'm not going to
surprise.
Okay. All right.
One last thing. So Della Barrett was the environmental at-large alternate for Eric, and she has resigned her position. So I'm going to be sending out. I'm going to solicit applications from the different environmental groups to to replace her. So if you guys know anyone that might be a good candidate, let me know.
Yeah, some spots to fill. All right. Anything else before we adjourn? All right, meeting adjourned. Have a fabulous summer, everyone. See you in the fall.